This is the lesson for Tuesday, August 25th, 2020. We know that Jacques Cartier is going to come to the New World in the 1730s. He is going to look for the Northwest Passage but fail. But he's going to see several places that would make excellent settlements. He is going to go to the king, and he's going to suggest that the king create settlements in a land which he believes would be good for France. It is not until the beginning of the 1600s, the 17th century, that the King of France will act upon this information, and he will send Samuel de Champlain to the St. Lawrence River. Champlain will begin making settlements along the St. Lawrence River, the biggest being Quebec and Montreal, but he will make others. Samuel de Champlain is going to be referred to as the father of New France. He is the one who is going to make a multitude of settlements. He goes to New France with the attitude that France must be nice to the Indians. Now, Champlain believed that furs would probably be the most money-making export from New France. And Champlain believed that it would be the Native Americans who would then catch the furs and then trade them to the French, who would then load them on ships and take them back to New France. Now, this of course meant you had to have good relations with the Native Americans. Here is a short piece on Samuel de Champlain and his efforts to make friends with the Indians.
Ever since Cartier's time, French and Basque fishermen have been trading furs with the Montagnais Indians. At first, it is only a sideline. But by the early 17th century, the profits are turning out to be spectacular. One of the French adventurers at Tadoussac in the summer of 1608 is a former soldier turned explorer and mapmaker. His name is Samuel de Champlain. Champlain's backers order him to find a new location, away from the competition.
The country is fine and level, and the soil better than in any place I had seen, with extensive woods. Along the shores, one would think the trees had been planted as ornaments.
He comes up with a bold but simple plan. Go beyond Tadoussac into the little-known lands farther west, build a new trading post, and spend the winter there. When spring comes, the Indians of the interior will bring their furs to Champlain first. In July, he sets off along the river with 100 men and stops at a place he has seen once before.
I looked for a proper place for our settlement, but I could find nothing more suitable or better situated than the point of Quebec, so called by the natives, which was covered with nut trees. I at once employ a part of our workmen in cutting them down to make a site for our settlement.
Champlain's men quickly build a storehouse and 3 fortified buildings.
The cold was more extreme than in France and lasted much longer. You don't know this country unless you spend winter there. There are 6 months of winter in this country.
Champlain is sure his men have everything they might need.
All those who were with me were well clad, slept in good beds, and were kept warm and well fed.
While Champlain works on his maps, his men wait and wait. Among them, a surgeon, Bonheur, and a man named Lataille. The youngest is Etienne Brulé, just 16. Champlain considers him a son and calls him my boy. But finally, spring comes, and with it, fresh food and hope.
It is a remarkable thing that 2 or 3 fathoms of snow and ice on the river should all be melted in less than 12 days. On the 8th of April, the air was still rather cold. Some of those who were ill with the scurvy got better. On the 5th of June, there arrived at our settlement a ship, which gave me much joy and relief.
The French need allies and teachers if they are to unlock the secrets of this land. There is much to learn. The Montagnais and the Algonquin have already been trading with the French for 10 years. They are allies of the powerful Huron who live near the Great Lakes. Together they control the territory north of the St. Lawrence. To the south live their traditional enemies, the Iroquois, a confederation of 5 nations. For now, the Iroquois are cut out of the trade with the Europeans. In the summer of 1609, Champlain learns a basic lesson about doing business in North America. No trade without a military alliance. Champlain already knows the Algonquin chief Iroquet, who introduces him to a new partner, the Huron chief Uchetaguin. They urge him to go to war with them against the Iroquois.
I promised to help them in their wars, both to engage them the more to love us, and also to help my enterprises and explorations, which could only be carried out with their help.
Realizing he can do nothing without Indian allies, Champlain agrees. For a month, they head south through lands no European has ever seen. At Ticonderoga Point, they finally meet the enemy. On the night of July 30th, the 2 sides prepare for battle.
The whole night was spent in dances and songs on both sides, with many insults. Our side telling the Iroquois that they would see such deeds of arms as they had never seen.
At dawn, they come face to face with 200 Iroquois warriors.
our Indians told me that those who had the big headdresses were the chiefs, and that there were only 3 of them, whom you could recognize by these feathers, which were larger than those of their companions. I was to do what I could to kill them. Our Indians called me with loud cries. They divided into 2 groups, made way for me, and put me ahead. As soon as they caught sight of me, halted and stared at me. When I saw them make a move to draw their bows upon us, I took aim with my arquebus and fired straight at one of the 3 chiefs. I had put 4 bullets into my arquebus. As soon as our people saw this shot so favorable for them, they began to shout loudly. Meanwhile, the arrows flew thick on both sides. The Iroquois were much astonished that 2 men should have been killed so quickly. This frightened them greatly. As I was reloading my arquebus, one of my companions fired a shot. Seeing their chiefs dead, they lost courage and took flight into the depth of the forest.
The alliance is sealed in blood. Champlain has passed his first test.
We all separated with great declarations of mutual friendship. They asked me if I would not go to their country and help them like a brother. I promised them.
The French are now partners in a great alliance, but they have also made the 5 nations of the Iroquois their mortal enemies. For almost a century to come, they will pay the price.
The French also asked Jesuit missionaries to come to New France to deal with the Indians. The Jesuit missionaries of New France had a remarkably different attitude toward the Native Americans than, say, the Spanish Jesuit priests. The French Jesuit priests are going to call for good relations with the Indians. They are not going to insist that the Indians convert to the Catholic faith. They are going to look the other way when fur trappers will have a wife in every village. France is going to firmly establish its fur trade in New France. Now, the way this works is the Indians would go out during winter and they would trap the fur-bearing animals. The pelts from these fur-bearing animals would then come to a central point, to use a French term, a rendezvous, where members of the French trappers would trade knives, guns, anything that the Indians saw of value. Now again, we're going to have good relations, so giving an Indian a gun, giving an Indian a hatchet, giving an Indian a knife is going to make the French trappers look very good. The furs and other raw materials will be sent to France. France in turn will send back finished goods. So the country of France will send back blankets and knives and guns, anything that the Native Americans could see of value. Now, there were some agricultural products that will be sent to New France, but for the most part, not many. In the late 1600s, the French trapper Louis Joliet and the priest Jacques Marquette will travel down the Illinois River and discover the present-day state of Missouri. Now, most people believe that the Illinois River emptied into a much bigger river, which the French called the Mississippi. So Marquette and Joliet will go down the Illinois. They will enter the Mississippi, and if you know much about geography, you know about 15 miles south of this junction, the Missouri River enters. Now, they named the river in honor of the Native Americans of that region, the people of the Muddy River, or the Missouri or Missouri, depending upon your pronunciation. They got as far as the Ohio River and they came back. A couple of years later, Sieur de La Salle is going to travel from the Lake Michigan, down the Illinois, down the Mississippi, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. All along the way, he will look for places to create settlements. He refers to this land and names it in honor of the king, King Louis, or Louisiana. Now, as La Salle returned back, he proposed that settlements be built along the Mississippi River. The first settlement in what is now Missouri was named in honor of the Queen, St. Genevieve. That was quickly followed by a settlement named in honor of the King, St. Louis. Now, St. Louis is just a few miles downstream from where the Missouri enters the Mississippi. But what was appealing to St. Genevieve is that Native Americans would come to the river and trade galena with the French fur trappers. Now, galena is a mineral. If you smelt it down, you create lead, and lead was awfully important. Now, La Salle decided that the best way to get the lead to France was to create another permanent settlement toward the end of the Mississippi River. He sailed to this spot, but his ship ran aground, his crew mutinied, and La Salle was killed. St. Genevieve was started at the beginning of the 1700s. It was the southernmost French settlement until the French and Indian War. By the start of the 1800s, by the start of the 18th century, that would be 1700s, New France was firmly established and becoming a big part of the French economy. Well, we need to now draw a line in our notes and do the Dutch. Henry Hudson, who was an Italian sailor, will sail in the year 1600 for the New World. Now, Hudson knows that up along the St. Lawrence River is the French settlement. And if he was to go as far south as Florida, he would be in the Spanish settlement. So he chose the Hudson River. Now, the Hudson River obviously was named in honor of him. He believed that the Hudson River was the Northwest Passage. He got as far as what is now Albany and realized that it wasn't. Hudson came back to Holland and suggested to the king and queen that they establish a new colony in this area. The new colony would be called New Netherlands. In 1624, in the colony of New Netherlands, the first settlement was created, New Amsterdam. Now, New Amsterdam is where the East River and the Hudson River come together to form what is now New York Harbor. Let's hear a little bit more about Henry Hudson.
Henry Hudson was the greatest explorer whose dreams never came true.
Henry Hudson was an English navigator and explorer who repeatedly tried to find a route from Europe to Asia without success.
He is considered the person who is in effect responsible for the founding of New York City, and he is also considered one of the founding figures of Canada because of his discovery on Hudson Bay.
Little is known of Hudson's early life, but many believe he was born around 1565 in England. Hudson became a skilled sailor and navigator.
In 1607, he convinced a group of investors to sponsor an expedition that would take him from England to East Asia.
The goal was to find an ice-free passage to China, sailing essentially north around the European continent.
In the next 2 years, Hudson tried twice to find a route to the Far East via the Arctic Ocean, but he was unsuccessful. Between expeditions, Hudson is believed to have married and had 3 sons.
In 1609, with the backing of Dutch investors, Henry Hudson decided he would try to look for the Northwest Passage. His crew sailed south and west across the Atlantic Ocean.
Hudson turns south and sails into New York Bay and up the Hudson River that bears his name today, looking for some kind of inlet or bay that would turn out to be a passage through the continent.
In 1610, this time sailing under the British flag, Hudson again tried to find the Northwest Passage to the Pacific. This time following a more northern route, he sailed into what is now the Hudson Strait, and then into the bay.
When he sails into Hudson Bay, which of course is large enough so there's actually tidal pull in the bay, it was very easy to mistake it for a passage to the Pacific. And Hudson was not willing to believe otherwise.
He and his crew spend the rest of the summer looking for a passage farther west, because they realize they are not in East Asia.
In November 1610, Hudson's ship became icebound in the Hudson Bay during a terrible winter. Finally, in June, the ship was able to leave, but Hudson refused to go home, and so the crew mutinied.
They placed Henry Hudson, his son, and about 7 other members of the crew in a shallop, a small boat, and set them adrift, and then proceeded to take the ship back to England. Henry Hudson and the other maroon sailors were never heard from again.
Many people think that Henry Hudson was a failure because he never achieved his life's goal, which was to find a quick water route to Asia. What we should remember is that he was an able navigator, that his ships always made it back to their investors, and that there is now more water named for Henry Hudson than any other human being who's ever lived.
The Dutch government will take the land that Hudson had discovered and they will divide it into sections. And each section will be given to a wealthy New Netherlands person who promised to be loyal to the king. Now, the land was called patroons, and each of the people who owned the land were called patroonships. Now, these patroons would then do business with the Native Americans. Now, depending upon who the patroon was, some of them would trade freely with the Indians, some not so. And so the relationship between the Dutch and the Indians was never as good as the relationship between, say, the French and the Indians. The Dutch government controlled the land quite briskly. They felt that it would become an integral part of the Dutch government. They believed that raw materials should leave from New Netherlands, come to Holland, they would be turned into finished goods and then brought back. In the middle of the 1600s, as English colonies began to get bigger and bigger, the English king, Charles II, will see New Netherlands as a threat to his thriving colony of Massachusetts and his thriving colony of Virginia. He will order his brother, the Duke of York, to go into what is now New York Harbor and take the land away from the Dutch. New York State, New Jersey will become the 2 American states that came out of the New Netherlands. Well, this is it. You are done with the second lesson. We will take our quiz this Friday, so again, please make sure that you are ready for it.